Amazing tones of Heavy D and the boys. Now that we've found love on that crispy kaira, Merry Christmas.
Thanks.
Yeah, you Grinch. Verity Johnson, Merry Christmas. I'm Wallace Chapman. Checkpoint next. I am back tomorrow 3:45.
Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, the Financial Stability Report, translation. The labour market's as tight as a drum, inflation's red hot, mortgage rates are headed one way and that's up. And more homeowners could be staring down the barrel of negative equity. We'll have what you need to know. Buy now, pay later, credit check first though. The government's tightening the rules around the fast-growing loan services. Controversy alert. Did Black Caps captain Kane Williamson drop the ball, like literally drop the ball, and stay quiet? And an Aussie zoo narrowly avoids a catastrophe. Don't forget you can watch us live, Sky Channel 83, Freeview Channel 50. RNZ News at 5 o'clock. Good afternoon. Ahi Marie ko Evie Ashton tēnei. There's no relief in sight for those struggling with high mortgage costs, with the central bank saying more rate hikes are likely needed to combat inflation. It's found New Zealand's financial system is fundamentally sound, but the cost of living will continue to bite for many households and businesses. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
The international impact of the pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine continue to send waves of economic disruption and uncertainty crashing upon New Zealand's shores. The fight against inflation continues, with expectations the Reserve Bank will keep pushing up the cost of borrowing in a bid to dampen demand. That means the risk of homeowners going into negative equity or defaulting on loans also keeps rising. The government says banks operate under a social licence and have a responsibility to support customers through good times and bad.
Low unemployment means many businesses are struggling to find workers. The Wellington Cafe Midnight Espresso needs a couple of extra hands, and the duty manager Ella says it's hard work being short-staffed.
It's kind of obvious. You can see when you walk in, there's plates that can't be cleared because we don't have enough people. There's only one person on the counter, so kind of customers start walking out because our service becomes a little bit slower.
Ella says it's a juggle trying to attract staff with higher pay rates while at the same time not hiking food prices and putting off customers. Emergency managers on the West Coast say the next few hours are the most critical as heavy rain lashes the region. Orange level warnings remain in place for several parts of the South Island, with rivers along the coast rising rapidly. Officials are closely monitoring the Hokitika River, with high tide due at 7 tonight. Westland District Council's Civil Defence Controller, Simon Bastian, says the next few hours are the most pivotal.
If we can get through to early evening, the rain starts dissipating early morning. So the second high tide will be just after 6 tomorrow morning. So it's basically getting through that period, and then we should be all clear, hopefully.
Simon Bastian says motorists shouldn't be travelling, with some localised flooding being reported. Watercare has shut down an Auckland treatment plant that it has only just spent $2 million upgrading. Last month, Watercare said levels of the so-called forever chemicals of the PFAS group at the Onehunga plant had been too high on 4 occasions. It says most samples have been well below the new limit for drinking water that kicks in on November the 14th, but that approaching change has spurred the shutdown. Watercare doesn't know how long the plant will be shut. The Auckland Council is investigating the source and if contamination is ongoing. The government is planning to regulate buy now, pay later schemes in line with credit cards so customers don't fall into unmanageable debt. From next year, affordability checks will be required for loans over a certain threshold, currently proposed to be $600. Commerce and Consumer Affairs Minister David Clark says the changes will prevent vulnerable people getting into a debt spiral.
Some people find themselves in a debt spiral. They get into a situation where they go without food, or they have their kids not able to afford raincoats or shoes. It's very basic stuff. We think there should be a duty of care on people to make sure they're lending money responsibly and appropriately.
David Clark says providers will need to have hardship processes in place and belong to a dispute resolution scheme. New Zealanders last year spent $1.7 billion through the schemes, up from $755 million in 2020. And Tracy Hicks' 6-term mayoralty in Gore is officially over after a judge dismissed his bid for a recount. Mr Hicks lost to 23-year-old Ben Bell by just 8 votes, a margin of just 0.169% of those cast. It means Mr Bell will now become New Zealand's youngest ever mayor when sworn in. In sport, the Kiwi Ferns concede they know very little about France ahead of their opening match at the Women's Rugby League World Cup in England tomorrow morning. Australia and New Zealand, who contested the last final 5 years ago, are expected to progress from pool play. France didn't compete at the last tournament, and Kiwis loose forward Georgia Hale says it's been difficult to scout them.
They did actually have one hit out against a local English side, so we did get to watch a bit of footage. But again, we haven't had much eyes on their side. They look pretty physical, which is a game that we like to play. So I'm sure it'll be a big contest in the middle, but our focus will more so be on us.
Golfer Lydia Ko has parted ways with her coach, Sean Foley. Ko announced the split on social media, saying it was due to logistical reasons. The timing of the breakup is odd, though. Ko has risen to number 3 in the world on the back of 2 wins and 11 top 5 finishes this season, her most consistent season on the LPGA Tour. Australian cyclist Carter Bettles has climbed his way into the Tour leader's yellow jersey by winning stage 4 of the Tour of Southland, the climb to the top of the Remarkables. Bettles has a 1 minute 21 second lead. And Tottenham are through to European football's Champions League knockout phase, topping their group after a 2-1 win over Marseille. Meanwhile, 2 pub owners in Germany are refusing to screen matches from this month's World Cup in Qatar in protest at the Gulf state's human rights record. That's the news.
Tonight on RNZ National, they've come to epitomise the quintessential Kiwi holiday and, for some, a viable and cost-effective place to live. We go big on caravans, old and new. Then it's into nature to soothe our nervous systems with cool, calming forest bathing. Get your popcorn ready because we're off to the movies with Simon Morris, and Hayden Donnell is in with us for Midweek Media Watch. Catch you after 7 for Nights with me, Charlotte Ryan, and for Karen Hay on RNZ National.
And we're on air on rnz.co.nz and on your mobile. You're with Lisa Owen next on Checkpoint. Right now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Thursday. From Northland to Taumadu Nui, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Taupo. Mainly fine today. Occasional rain tomorrow, clearing in the evening. Gisborne, Hawke's Bay, mainly fine. Some light rain possible tomorrow. From Taranaki to Wellington, including Taihape and Waididapa. Cloud increasing today with patchy rain about Taranaki and Wellington. Rain spreading everywhere tomorrow morning, then becoming fine apart from a few evening showers. Nelson and Marlborough, rain becoming widespread this evening, clearing to fine tomorrow morning. Canterbury Plains and Christchurch, mainly fine with high cloud. A few spots of rain is possible. Bulla, Westland, Fiordland, also Canterbury High Country, rain with heavy falls. Easing to showers tomorrow and clearing from Canterbury High Country. Northwest gales about Canterbury High Country today. Otago and Southland, some rain spreading south from this evening, clearing later tomorrow. And for Kohu, the Chatham Islands, cloudy with occasional drizzle. It's 7 minutes past 5. I'll have news headlines and traffic for you at 20 past 5.
Nā mihi e ho. Tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki Checkpoint e tēnei rā, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Homeowners and businesses beware. There's more pain on the horizon in the form of higher interest rates as the central bank continues to wage war on inflation. The Reserve Bank has warned the cost of borrowing will continue to rise as the cost of living continues to bite. Persistently low unemployment has been hailed as good news by the government, but there's a more pessimistic response from some economists who say that's putting more pressure on inflation. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
At the supermarket, at the petrol pump, rates, insurance and covering the mortgage or rent. Everyone is feeling the bite.
Shopping for vegetables in the supermarket, I am amazed when I look at the docket and think, oh my goodness, how did it get to be so expensive?
Like, we're fortunate and we're managing pretty well, but it's super hard for people on lower incomes.
There's a lot of people suffering, man, yeah.
One of the jobs of the Reserve Bank is to keep an eye on financial stability, looking at the ability of banks, households and businesses to weather financial shocks. Deputy Governor Christian Hawkesby says the pressures on the New Zealand economy reflect a turbulent global environment.
The rising global interest rates necessary to curb inflation will test New Zealand's financial resilience. While our financial system as a whole is resilient, some households and businesses will be challenged.
Banks have been doing stress testing to see how households would cope if economic conditions deteriorate. There is the potential for some home loan borrowers to head into negative equity or default on their mortgages as they face higher repayments, a risk that will only increase. Bank Governor Adrian Orr has this advice for those under financial pressure.
The servicing of mortgages is where you need to stay very close to the banks. If they have lent wisely, then you are the wise person they have lent to, and they should be able to work with you through good times and bad.
CoreLogic's Nick Goodall says the downturn in the housing market is deepening and there's no end in sight, with interest rates set to rise. He says prices would need to fall by 31% to get to pre-pandemic levels, unlikely given the current economic conditions.
Assuming we still see that tightening of the monetary policy, we do expect to see further downfall in prices to the point where values might fall about 15 to 18% from peak of the market.
Unemployment is still at record lows, and new data out today shows wages are outpacing inflation. But ANZ economist Finn Robinson says for many it won't feel like they have a whole lot of extra money in their pocket.
Wage growth is surging, but high inflation and high interest rates mean that benefit that households might feel is more going towards maintaining living standards rather than improving them.
Finance Minister Grant Robertson is seeing the bright side of the unemployment stats.
We have more people in work in this quarter, about 35,000 more people in work. We should continue to celebrate that. I understand for businesses, many of them have had difficulty hiring the staff that they need. We've been working hard to make sure we train people up, give them the skills, and through immigration be able to address that.
National leader Chris Luxon is still pitching tax cuts as one solution, amid questions about whether that would be inflationary and give greater benefit to higher income earners. Much of the blame for the spiralling cost of living he places at the feet of the Labour government.
Because the government has been so utterly reckless with its government spending and driving so much wasteful spending with no outcomes, the Reserve Bank is forced to put the brakes on the economy, and that means they're lifting the interest rates more than they would need to if the government was controlling spending.
There are other storm clouds on the horizon: the ongoing impact of the pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the risk of any of New Zealand's key trading partners experiencing a major economic downturn.
And that was our political editor, Jane Patterson. We'll speak to Kiwi Bank's Jared Kerr about this shortly. It's almost 12 minutes after 5. Kia mau tunu mai. Do stay with us. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. And still to come, we'll get to the bottom of the Kane Williamson catch controversy. Sure, you guys will have lots to say about that. And the lions that made a bid for freedom at a Sydney zoo. As Rotorua grapples with the future of its emergency housing, the city's schools have been coping with the complex needs of children living in motels. Since the pandemic, schools near Fenton Street have taken in children living in transient accommodation. And while schools try to support their tamariki, often they don't have all the information necessary to do so. Our reporter Tom Taylor and camera operator Marika Habazi have the story.
There has to be an end point somewhere. That's what Rotorua Principal Nikki Brell says of the instability emergency accommodation is causing in his city. His primary school, Malfoy School, has a roll of 300, about 23 of whom live in emergency housing. But Mr. Brell says this number can fluctuate.
We don't know every child that's in emergency housing because their circumstances could change from one week to the next. And unless they come in and tell us, we wouldn't know.
Mr. Brell says support given to schools by various government departments has evolved as the situation in Rotorua develops. He says the government now funds some rental vans to get children to school.
Without that resource, we probably would not have achieved the attendance of as many kids as we would have liked.
However, Mr. Brell is concerned for children who have to move from one school to another as their accommodation circumstances change, sometimes at a moment's notice.
In our cluster here, we have 3 high schools in our immediate area, 1 intermediate down the road and a number of neighbouring primary schools. So it's a good area to, establish yourself. For the kiddies who are in emergency housing, it's hard to determine their future.
Down the road, Rotorua Intermediate has a roll of about 700 students. The school knows of 32 students living in emergency housing, but says the number could be higher. Learning Support Coordinator Dean Henderson says part of the difficulty schools face is a lack of knowledge about students' backgrounds.
Fenton Street, where all the hotels, are used for emergency accommodation, is on our back doorstep, so we don't know what we're getting. And often students will turn up and they're not from another school with a Rotorua, so we're ringing schools in Napier, we're ringing schools in Tauranga, we're ringing schools in Auckland to try and find out what these students' needs are, a little bit more about their background. And we're basically being detectives trying to find out how we can support these students best.
Mr. Henderson says as students in emergency or transitional housing move from primary to intermediate, they become more aware of differences in their home lives compared to their classmates.
These are teenage students who are basically trapped in hotel rooms, so they basically look around, find peers in the same situation. They're in the middle of the town, they band together, and sometimes, the temptation to go into town and get up to no good is too much for some of them.
Across the road from Rotorua Intermediate and just a kilometre from Malfroy School, a new Kāinga Ora development is in the works. When completed, it'll provide 37 new homes for people in need. But the nearby schools don't know how many extra kids that will bring into the area or what kind of pressure that will place on their school roles. Kāinga Ora's Regional Director in Bay of Plenty, Roxanne Cribb, says the agency is in regular contact with principals of schools near new homes. She says the agency also informs the Ministry of Education how many homes will be built and when they're likely to have school-aged children living in them. Ms. Cribb says large developments like the one near Rotorua Intermediate will be home to children of all ages and says early and ongoing conversations will ensure their education needs can be met.
And our reporter Tom Taylor joins us now in the studio. Tom, some pretty significant challenges being faced by schools there. And what are the government agencies involved saying?
Yeah, so the Ministry of Education, a spokesperson there is saying that they've had vans collecting students from their emergency housing in the morning, then taking them back in the afternoon at the end of the school day. This began last year with around 50 students, but at its peak, there were around 160 students using that form of transport. Meanwhile, the Ministry of Social Development is saying that they've actually had a declining number of whānau in emergency housing in Rotorua. They say they're in a difficult position, as they'd like to be able to talk with schools to share any concerns, but they're not able to share any personal information about whānau for privacy reasons. They say the nature of emergency housing is such that it is an emergency situation, and families become homeless often because their rental has come to an end. But wherever possible, they seek to accommodate those families as close to the children's existing schools. The Ministry of Social Development also says that they link families with children in emergency housing to intensive case managers and contracted navigators, which helps them to stay connected to their community, health and education services and other necessary agencies.
Thanks for that, Tom. And if you were listening to Tom and Marika's piece on radio, do go online and check out the video version of that story. And also let us know your thoughts on this. Schools facing some pretty significant challenges with a number of students coming from that emergency transitional accommodation. 2101 on text or tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. Rising interest rates and falling house prices could push more homeowners into negative equity. That's just one of the risks highlighted in the Reserve Bank's latest 6-monthly financial stability report. The bank says while New Zealand's financial system is resilient, some businesses and homeowners could feel the squeeze with persistent inflation pressure and the increased cost of servicing debts. Right now, about 2% of mortgage holders are in negative equity. Now, that is where the size of their loan is more than the value of their property. And depending on how far house prices continue to drop, that could rocket to just under 40%, according to Reserve Bank estimates. Well, joining us now is Kiwibank Chief Economist Jared Kerr. Kia ora, Jared. Listening and reading this report, what concerns you the most from it?
Yeah, look, it's to be expected, right? We are in a downturn. House prices are falling, and some homeowners who came in late in 2021 have found themselves in negative equity. That's an uncomfortable position to be in, but we're not seeing the more concerning distressed sales yet. What we normally need to see is quite a sharp increase in unemployment before that happens, and today's data was very strong. We've got a very strong labour market and there's very good income growth. So we are, I guess, concerned that house prices are coming off and they will fall a little further, but we're not yet worried about distressed sales.
Okay, because people will remember the fallout from the global financial crisis, right? So I'm just wondering, how does our current situation and the conditions in the housing market compare to that?
Yeah, exactly right. Now, that was a very different situation. That was a global financial market crisis, and banks were under significant stress, and we saw unemployment rates rising quite sharply during that period. So that was a very deep contraction and obviously a global recession. There is risk that we see something similar, but nowhere near as bad as that in the coming year. I think we're in a much better position today than what we were 10 years ago. Banks have been forced through an age of regulation to hold a lot more capital, and our lending practices are a lot safer than what they were 10 years ago.
So negative equity is one measure of potentially people, facing financial pressure, but there will be other people under stress, and that will be a wider group, right? So do we have any idea how big that group is?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So that group of people who are in negative equity at the moment are around 2%, and that might rise. So long as they've got jobs, they'll keep paying off their mortgage. As you say, there are a lot of people, about 45%, coming up for refixing on their mortgages. So they've got current rates that they took out last year or the year before that are at really attractive 2.5% level, and now they're going on to 6-7% interest rates, which is a massive jump in their interest expense. Those households will find themselves with less discretionary income, and their ability to spend will be impacted.
Okay, so the flip side of this, as you mentioned, is unemployment, right? It's above maximum sustainable levels. So we've got runaway inflation. That's the key thing there. If it's at 3.3%, what is the sweet spot, do you reckon?
I think the unemployment rate from the Reserve Bank's perspective needs to be closer to 4.5, 5 than sort of 3.25 at the moment.
So to be grim, Jared, do we need people to lose their jobs to even out the economy?
That's a very blunt way of putting what the Reserve Bank is trying to do. Yes, we need to see the economy slow down. We need to see the demand in the economy better match the supply, and that's our way of saying, we need to alleviate the pressures that are out there generating inflation.
But that brings with it other pressure, right? When you lose your job, you can't pay your grocery bill, nor can you pay for a mortgage if you're lucky enough to have it. So what is the other solution? Immigration?
So that definitely helps. Yeah, absolutely. So to fill a lot of the jobs that are not being filled at the moment, migration would be a key part of that. And also, making sure that we're investing in the future. This is one sort of bugbear of mine, is that we don't invest enough in this country on key infrastructure, and using a slowdown as an example not to spend is simply not good enough.
Interesting to talk to you, Jared. Really appreciate your time. That is Jared Kerr, Kiwibank's Chief Economist. 22 after 5, and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Homai Ko whakaaro. We would love your feedback on anything you've heard on the program this evening. I'm sure you've got some thoughts on the interview we just did with Jared Kerr, who's saying 3.3% unemployment. Well, that's not high enough to even out the economy and slow down inflation. And actually, we probably need more people to lose their jobs. Text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Time to go to the headlines. Anea Evi, mena pita kōrero.
Kia ora, Lisa. An economist says the latest jobs numbers almost certainly cements the likelihood of a big interest rate rise by the Reserve Bank at the end of the month. Unemployment has held close to a record low of 3.3% and wages have risen at record rates. Police have found a body in Lake Rotorua and are working to formally identify the person. A member of the public notified the police this afternoon. It's not yet known if it's a man who went missing while kayaking over a week ago. The government is planning tighter regulation of buy now, pay later schemes so customers don't fall into unmanageable debt. From next year, affordability checks will be required for loans over a certain threshold, currently proposed to be $600. Emergency managers on the West Coast say the next few hours are the most critical as heavy rain lashes the region. Orange level warnings remain in place for several parts of the South Island, with rivers along the coast rising rapidly. And the police have received several reports of scam emails claiming to be them or other justice sector partners and are urging people to be cautious. The emails claim to have located explicit illegal material on the recipient's computer and say an arrest warrant will be issued if the person doesn't reply. Those are the headlines. Looking at traffic in Auckland, State Highway 20, the southwestern motorway northbound is blocked in the right lane because of a crash after Portage Road. For some reason, there are delays in both directions, so you may want to avoid the area if you can. North of Auckland, there was already a backup earlier this afternoon with a truck breakdown blocking the right eastbound lane of Hibiscus Coast Highway. There are possibly still delays heading north out of the city because of that. And in the Waikato, State Highway 24 is still closed between Te Poi Road and Matamata after a crash at around 2 o'clock this afternoon. Our next news headlines and traffic is at about 40 minutes past 5.
Ngā mihi, Evie. The Black Caps dropped a chance to wrap up a semi-final spot at the T20 World Cup with a game to spare. Following a 20-run loss to England last night, Black Caps captain Kane Williamson has come under scrutiny for his behaviour in the field. Sound the controversy alarm. Felicity Reid is in the studio. What is he saying about this situation?
Well, he's saying he's a little bit embarrassed about it. And it's not the loss to England, the first loss of the tournament. It's actually his behaviour in the field after what he thought was a catch to dismiss opener Josh Buttler. England got off to a bit of a flyer last night. So when Josh Buttler scooped a ball through cover in the sixth over off Mitch Santner's spin bowling, Kane Williamson thought he'd pulled off this great, spectacular and rather timely catch. As the ball went, and it was a little bit of a swan dive, right? He was catching, he was sort of falling, he landed on his chest, which is where part of this controversy comes in. Williamson is known as a bit of a good guy around cricket, so you'd expect him to, own up maybe if he knows he has dropped a catch. So Buttler was on his way back to the pavilion there, and third umpire's TV replay showed that actually Williamson had bobbled the ball, had hit his hand, had hit his turf, and then he'd sort of scooped it back into his chest.
Oh, rhetorical question. Did he really not know?
Well, he didn't get up in jubilation. He wasn't claiming it straight away. He wasn't sort of showing off But, he also didn't...
Not claiming it straight away, but not also making it clear that it was not a catch. And if you need a 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th umpire, I can find you them in the Checkpoint office. It is a cause of much debate.
Social media probably have a few of those 5th, 6th, 7th umpires as well. He's been called a cheat, and maybe if he was a different player from a different country, maybe he would have been hit a little bit harder with that cheating
allegation
tag.
Yeah.
Yes. He did sort of wave a little bit of an apology to Josh Buttler, who he had to call back to the wicket as well, but...
The wave of shame. Let's move to a different World Cup. The Kiwi Ferns kick off their Rugby League World Cup campaign in England tomorrow. How's their preparation for the tournament gone?
Well, they take on the three-time champs. They take on France, who didn't play at the last tournament. So the scouting for France has been a little bit difficult. But there's actually the off-field things that have been, I guess, a little bit more of a disruption for them. There was a fire in their training facility earlier this week, which actually meant that the players, they weren't inside the building at the time. They're actually out on the field. And it's It's unexplained as to how this fire happened, but they lost cell phones and personal belongings to smoke damage. So this is kind of a big deal for a team of semi-professional players, women who have left families at home. They couldn't call home for 24 hours during this. It's not really the ideal preparation for a World Cup.
Unsettling, yeah.
Oh, exactly. Their coach is calling it a freak accident, and they're not really prepared to use it as an excuse. I mean, they've got 5 games in 17 days. You don't really have time to dwell on these types of things.
Yeah. Hey, thanks for that, Felicity. Felicity Reid, sports reporter there. Let us know your reckons on the whole Kane Williamson thing. 2101, or you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. People who own homes in flood zones might see their property values sink, according to the Reserve Bank. It's suggested banks could tighten their lending criteria in flood-prone areas, finding in Auckland more than 1 in 4 houses with mortgages are in zones that could be affected by a severe flooding event. Anei te kairipoata, Katie Todd.
Worst part is the no warning. There was no warning, and I was screaming to my family to get up and get out. My dad, he got up and he said, "Oh, what's wrong, girl?" I said, "The bank's gone, Dad, we got to get out."
I was sitting at the table having spaghetti and eggs for breakfast. It's only just going down the road, and then next minute I was up our driveway, the backyard, the front yard, it was everywhere.
In 2017, families living in Edgecombe were swamped when the levee bank collapsed and a wall of water surged into low-lying parts of the town. It's a devastating experience that's becoming all too familiar, and among the many people it's now impacting is prospective home buyers. A search of Trade Me reveals the words flood-free and out of flood zone now appearing on dozens of house listings as buyers add flood risk to their checklist. Summit Real Estate's Glenn Delaney says Nelson's property market has been impacted by a deluge that struck in August.
Especially out-of-town buyers, the first thing they ask us is the property, or has the property been affected by the recent weather and flooding, landslips, etc. And there has been a number of areas affected worse than others. And even locals are probably shying away from those areas that are prone to flooding and landslips.
Professor Ela Noy is the chair in the Economics of Disasters and Climate Change at Victoria University. He explains the biggest hurdle between buyers and flood risk properties isn't the criteria set by their banks, but by insurers.
So if insurance retreats from an area because they decide that this risk is too high, for whatever reason, maybe they have a new model that suggested too high, maybe they realize that the climate change has caused the risk to become higher than what they're comfortable with, or their models are just better, insurers can decide not to renew your insurers, and then you are in technical default of your loan.
But how closely are the banks looking at flood risk themselves? The Reserve Bank's been investigating, asking the country's biggest banks to measure how much of their mortgage portfolios are exposed to sea level rise. The result, more than 1 in 10 houses with mortgages nationally could be affected by flooding under a severe climate change model. In Auckland, more than 1 in 4 mortgaged homes are in that red zone. The Reserve Bank says banks can avoid exposure to that risk by tightening lending requirements in flood zones. Its Manager of Financial System Analysis is Chris McDonald.
It highlights for us that banks do need to consider these risks. And I think because, even though the scenarios are forward-looking, I think because the banks are lending for 30 years, it means that banks need to start to consider these risks sooner than that, very soon in fact.
It seems Kiwi Bank is taking the Reserve Bank's feedback on board. The bank says while it doesn't currently consider flood risk, it will likely be considered in future credit assessments. But those future calculations are much more top of mind for those who have lost everything to floods, as this elderly resident of Edgecombe told us 5 years ago.
I have the offer of a flat that I can have. I'd prefer to do that and have time to think about what we're going to do, where I'm going to go, whether you're going to... I couldn't rebuild on that section. I've lived there all my life. I don't particularly now want to go back.
It is 28 minutes to 6. Kia mau tonu mai. Stay with us. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. Ko taku hoia inai ko Nona Peltier, his here to talk business. She swept into the studio. Sky TV shareholders, they can expect $70 million by the end of the month. What are the dates?
Well,
It turns out that they had been talking about giving back $70 million, but through a buyback of shares. This isn't going to be a buyback of shares. It's just going to be a straight payout, 40 cents for every share that you have. And the payout is expected at the end of the month. So that should be making a lot of shareholders happy because it was voted for overwhelmingly in today's annual meeting. However, the company said that they're still looking at a share buyback, the details of which they're going to announce in February when they announce their interim financial report. That did not go down very well with the shareholders, some of the shareholders there, very concerned about the cancellation of shares. So when you buy back shares, you basically, reduce the number of them. But in theory, and that's a theory, they stay the same value. They just increase in value. So the market capitalization of the company remains the same. But that hasn't happened in the past, and people are very afraid it won't happen in the future. So it wasn't a great thing. On the other hand, they did say they were going to pay more out in dividends. So overall, you would have thought it would be a really big positive meeting, but it was kind of testy.
Tell us about A2. This is the milk. It's taking its competitors to court in Australia. Who are they marching off to?
Do you know what A2 is? That company that produces that specialty milk.
Yeah.
The one that if you're allergic to the A1 milk, you can't drink A1 milk. So, but A2 you can. It's got nothing to do with lactose intolerance. So, you could eat ice cream, A2 milk ice cream, but not the other kind. So anyway, they cornered the market by trademarking not just the brand A2, but also they have rights to the actual process that's involved in delivering it. So very nice for A2, and they've done very well in marketing their products all over the world. However, an Australian company, a competitor, decided that was a really good logo and started using it on their products. So A2 Milk tried to resolve this through the regular channels like Stop It. That didn't work. And so now they're taking them to a federal court in New South Wales. They're seeking damages, unspecified at this point. But they are
so testing the copyright.
They say, look, this is our trademark.
Yep.
And you can't use it. That's it.
And Nona, what do you bring for us from the markets, please?
Well, the market fell nearly 1/3%. That was a 34-point drop to 11,283, which isn't really unexpected. We are, for example, expecting an interest rate hike from the Reserve Bank here in New Zealand overnight. We're going to be hearing from the U.S. Federal Reserve on interest rates. So the markets are a little bit worried, a little bit wobbly, as they say. The Kiwi dollar, so let me just finish that. The Kiwi dollar, that's right. It rose a little bit on the interest rate, anticipated interest rate hike from the Reserve Bank. And not just that. Looks like we're going to be seeing a hike for a while, given the strength of the employment sector and so forth. So 58.7 US cents.
Wow.
And then just a touch under 91.4 Australian, which is a pretty toppy number, and 51 British pence.
51 British pence has finally moved, Nona.
It has.
Nona Peltier there with Business News. The unemployment rate has remained unchanged at a record low of 3.3%. While many may see low unemployment rates as a positive, a lack of potential employees is spelling disaster for some businesses. Reporter Samuel Rilstone and camera operator Angus Drever spoke to some Wellington businesses about how they're dealing with staff shortages.
It's hard to walk down the street at the moment and not see an ad in a window calling out for workers. Everyone seems to have staff shortages. On the website Seek, job advertisements are up 22% on last year. Kazu's Sushi and Noodle Shop on Lambton Quay in Wellington is one of many businesses with vacancy signs in their window. Assistant manager Lan says it's hard work with not enough staff.
Every couple of days or a couple of months, it was like heaps of people. There's a lot of working holiday. They would drop off CV or student or just like whatever people. Now, maybe 1 or 2 CV a year, which is really, really scary.
Pre-COVID, Kazu had 4 to 5 staff, but now have been reduced to just 2 for the last couple of years. Lan says she tells her workers to be honest with customers and close early when they're at capacity.
I'll tell my staff to try what you can. When it's just too much honest with customers, sorry, that's all we can do, because I don't want the quality of the food going down.
With so few staff, any sickness or absence results in the worst outcome.
When someday like I'm sick or I had COVID for a week and no one filled in, we had to close the shop.
Across town on Cuba Street, Midnight Espresso sports a colourful staff wanted sign in the front window. The cafe has only had the sign in the window for around 2 weeks, looking to fill 1 or 2 part-time roles due to high turnover. While only looking for a couple of part-timers, duty manager Ella says the strain on a busy rush is still there.
Especially with the school holidays, when we had like 1 or 2 people missing on a shift, it would just be slammed and we would be absolutely like just thrown under the bus with work to do. It's kind of obvious, you can see when you walk in, there's plates that can't be cleared because we don't have enough people. There's only one person on the counter, so kind of customers start walking out because our service becomes a little bit slower.
And the challenge of low wages versus product prices is still ever present.
Unfortunately, we can't be charging $15 for just a small little sandwich, and so it's really difficult trying to manage the balance of paying your people enough and keeping them really happy and making sure they feel valued versus making sure customers don't walk in and go, what the hell are these prices?
Hospitality has borne the brunt of the impact of COVID, and Ella says there's an ongoing tension in the industry.
It's definitely really scary. It feels as if most cafes are just like a couple of really horrible weeks from closing down. And I wouldn't say that's the case for us. We're definitely in a very privileged position. We've been here for a very long time. Nobody wants to be at a job where it's like kind of in fear of like, are there going to be enough hours next week? Are we going to have not enough staff next week? Like, what's going to happen?
The low unemployment number is a good sign people have jobs, but it means the job of those looking for workers is much harder.
And you can check out the video version of Sam and Angus's story. It'll be on our webpage. Let's get to some of your feedback now on the issue of inflation, rising cost of living, mortgage, interest rates, all of that stuff. Roz says, if the way to balance the economy is to drive employment down to 5%, then the country has a moral obligation to ensure that the unemployed are not demonised and are given benefits sufficient to allow them to live a decent life. James says, regarding the idea that in order to slow inflation, unemployment needs to go up. Presumably, this wouldn't work if the newly unemployed received benefits equalling their prior wages. What the Reserve Bank is saying is that more people need to be poor, says James. And another person is pretty much agreeing there is something truly sick in a society that wants to increase unemployment. The economy was invented to help people live together more easily. People were not created to be units to make an economy function. That from Tony. Do keep your feedback coming, 2101 on text, or you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. It is 20 to 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Homai Ofakara, we love to hear from you, so do send in your feedback. Some of you getting in touch about the Kane Williamson catch, not a catch. We'll get to that a bit later. Add your thoughts to the mix, 2101 on text, or you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. It is time to head to the headlines with Evie. Ko Evie anō tēnei.
Kia ora, Lisa. The National Party leader, Christopher Luxon, says the government needs to crack down on inflation now before it gets worse. In its 6-monthly financial stability report, the Reserve Bank says households face pressure from falling house prices and rising interest rates. And Kiwi Bank chief economist Jared Kerr told Checkpoint about 2% of property owners are currently in negative equity, and that might rise. He says while there is concern about house prices falling, he's not yet worried about distressed sales. The central bank says more rate hikes are likely to combat inflation. A financial mentor who helps people budget says new regulations for buy now, pay later schemes will help people who turn to the schemes in desperation. The government is planning to make affordability checks required for buy now, pay later loans over a certain threshold, proposed to be $600. Bailiffs will now wear body cameras when they serve warrants, eviction notices and other court documents. In a move the Justice Ministry says will improve safety and accountability. They'll have to let people know they're recording, but the camera also has a front-facing screen so the person can see what's being taped. And Israel's former Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has told supporters in Jerusalem he's on the brink of a big victory. Exit polls put his right-wing bloc narrowly ahead in the country's general election. Those are the headlines. Looking at traffic, tow trucks are on the way to a crash in Auckland's State Highway 20, the southwestern motorway northbound. It's blocked in the right lane after Portage Road, but there are delays in both directions. Resurfacing works will completely close State Highway 2 tonight between Paidor and Waihi from 8 this evening until 5 tomorrow morning. And adjacent to that area, State Highway 24 between Te Poi Road and Matamata is still closed after a crash at around 2 this afternoon. I'll have news and weather for you at 6.
Thanks, Evie. And as you heard in the headlines there, Buy Now, Pay Later services will have to check if consumers can afford the debt they're taking on as the government cracks down on the industry. The services, including Afterpay, Lay-Buy and Zip Pay, allow people to get the goods with one upfront payment and pay the rest off in instalments. Consumers can be charged late fees if they default, but unlike credit cards, there's no interest. The services are not currently covered by the Consumer Finance Act, so don't have to check if people can afford the repayments. But that's set to change, and Commerce and Consumer Affairs Minister David Clark explains.
Credit check at the $1 mark, and it's at the $600 mark. It's a suitability and affordability test.
Right, at the $1 mark there'll be checks, and you are suggesting when the loan gets as high as $600, you're going to require more stringent assessment of whether the person can afford it. Okay.
That's absolutely right.
So what's going to be the benchmark then for what is acceptable? Because we know from budgeting services that people often have half a dozen Buy Now, Pay Later services on the go at the same time.
Yeah, the point of having it from $1, having a comprehensive credit check, is to see whether people already have other products that they have on credit. So we can know the landscape right from the beginning, no matter whether it's a $10 purchase at the supermarket, some tomato sauce or a little bit more for a block of cheese these days, or whether they're buying a new suit. Whatever it is that people are putting on these products needs to first have a credit check that's comprehensive. Then we're saying at a higher threshold, and we're also seeking feedback on whether 600 is the right amount. Another range of checks would kick in that would bring it more in line with the credit checks for existing products in the market. We think, we are moving ahead of the world here. We will be one of the first countries, if not the first country, to regulate these products, which were designed to avoid this kind of regime. And we're doing it because we have seen evidence of harms in the market, and certainly overseas there are trends that show that there's harms out there for people who are vulnerable and who are being given money at times that they can't afford.
Do you think it's okay to extend Buy Now, Pay Later services for the purchase of alcohol, for example, for the purchase of overseas holidays? Are you comfortable with that, Minister?
This is a vexed question because it's exactly the same one that applies to credit cards. We have people now who use their credit cards for purchasing alcohol or for purchasing overseas travel, and we don't generally make judgments about people's purchases, but what it is appropriate to do is to really assess whether they can actually afford to repay the money that's being lent to them. In many cases with Buy Now, Pay Later products, the charges for missing a payment, the sector will argue, is actually more lenient than lots of the other credit products in the market, and so it's a cheaper form of lending for people, but we want to be sure that that's the case. Even if someone can only just not afford something, it's still true that they can't afford it. And so we think it's appropriate that there are checks and balances in place and that vulnerable people are not being lent money that they can't afford to repay.
Do you think you're going far enough here? Because some of the issues that budget services have raised with us is the unsolicited raising of the line of credit that people are able to get. And another thing is push notifications encouraging people to spend, offering them special deals and incentivising further loans. So are you going far enough with what you're doing?
Well, I think this will be the kind of thing we will want feedback on. Ultimately, with this new regime coming into play, it will require suitability and affordability assessments to be carried out before someone is lended significant amounts of money. And that, we think, is the most important thing. Push notifications and other things, though, will be an indication of whether lenders are behaving in a responsible manner. If they know that the people they're sending them to are not able to afford that borrowing, then that would, I would think, be a breach of the law.
How long before you put this in place?
It will be next year, and I would expect probably later in the year. We want to work through these things carefully. As I say, we are one of the first movers here in the world. We want to get this right, but we think it's really important to go ahead with it.
And that's the Minister for Commerce and Consumer Affairs, David Clark. He says we're one of the first movers in the world, but are we moving far enough, fast enough? 2101 on text, or you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. It's a life-changing device for type 1 diabetics, but continuous glucose monitors come at a huge cost. Pharmac is refusing calls to fund the devices, despite evidence of huge savings to the health budget. Nearly 30,000 New Zealanders are living with type 1 diabetes, and the prevalence in school children is growing to around 1 in 500. And as Louise Tanuth reports, parents say life without the devices is extremely challenging.
It's a round disc about the size of a $2 coin that sticks to your arm and checks your glucose levels 24/7 without the pain of pricking your finger several times a day. When linked to an insulin pump, it removes the risks for type 1 diabetics, preventing seizures, fainting and even death from low blood sugar. 28-year-old Jack Coford was told to give up on his dream of becoming a pilot after failing his medical exam 2 years ago when his type 1 diabetes was picked up for the first time. Just weeks ago, he finally got clearance to become one of very few pilots in the country with type 1 diabetes, thanks to a CGM.
There's alarms on there that make you aware that if your levels are trending in a direction within a certain amount of time, if you're going anywhere near that, within half an hour, your phone or whatever is going to make some noises. It gets quite annoying. It goes through your headset if you're in the plane, and then you can deal with it at the time.
But it's costing him about $400 a month. And while he says it's worth it for his dream job, it's not sustainable. He's not alone. Alicia Mitchell's 2 children and husband have type 1 diabetes. She's had to give up her job to look after them full-time. A few years ago, they made the switch to CGMs for the children. Life without them is not something she wants to revisit.
It's like having a newborn. In fact, it's probably worse than having a newborn. I had alarms every 2 hours throughout the night to get up and to check my children's blood sugars. So for me now, because I've got the alarms with the CGM, I can actually get more than 2 hours sleep at a time, but it comes at a massive cost.
But they can't afford another device for her husband. It's already costing them $12,000 a year. With other countries like Australia and the UK funding them, she says it's insulting.
It frustrates me to the point that we have looked at moving to Australia. It is something that we don't want to do because all our support network's here, but the money that we're losing every year and when we can get it somewhere else funded, it's incredibly tough.
The cost of diabetes in New Zealand is $2.1 billion a year and is predicted to increase by over $1 billion in the next 2 decades. But that money could be saved if all diabetics were given access to CGMs. According to endocrinologist and paediatrics diabetes specialist Dr. Ben Wheeler.
People with diabetes lose on average around 20 years of their lifespan. And if we're getting young, healthy children, if we can keep their glucose in target, that's an enormous benefit to our health system in preventing those complications, blindness, renal failure, dialysis, transplant, all of those things, heart disease.
He says as a country, we're lagging far behind.
We have the highest rates in the world for whatever reason. The South Island has higher rates than the North Island. So again, New Zealand really has to be at the forefront of how we apply new diabetes therapies. We shouldn't be at the very back of the queue.
A queue CEO of Diabetes New Zealand, Heather Very, says is never ending.
Very disappointingly, there's nothing from coming out of Pharmac to suggest that this technology will be funded. The standard response, which is that it's on the list, but until such time as they have money that they can allocate to it, they won't be funded.
In a statement, Pharmac says it has 2 CGMs on their options for investment list. They would like to fund them, but they need to make difficult choices.
Louise Tanuth reporting there, and it is 9 minutes to 6. The Football World Cup in Qatar is only 3 weeks away and the voices of protest are growing. Now a group of former and current Iranian athletes are urging FIFA to ban their national team from the tournament. The BBC's Azadeh Moshiri reports.
They call it the beautiful game, but football is rarely void of politics. Some Iranians are saying it's now a matter of life and death. That's why a group of former Iranian sports champions are demanding football's governing body FIFA remove Iran from the World Cup.
The football, which is the most popular sport in this planet, is the best way to show and to share our voices. So this is the only way we could share to the world that we need help.
But they're not the only ones asking for the ban. The Ukrainian Association of Football has also written to FIFA. They say Tehran has been supplying Russia with Iranian-made drones. That's something Iran's government denies.
When Iran killing this protester, more than, so far, 250 people have been killed. I mean, what is the difference between Iran and Russia? Russia attacked Ukraine, killed people, tortured people. It was the right decision. They got banned from everywhere. Same thing should happen and be applied to Iranian regime.
But a potential ban is likely to divide Iranians. Former national football players Ali Daei and Ali Karimi backed the protests in their country. But so far, they haven't called for a ban on their national team. Many Iranians are urging world leaders to support their fight against the regime. But football is a sport they adore, so FIFA's decision carries great weight for a nation that's in the midst of an historic battle.
The man accused of clubbing US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband in the head with a hammer has pleaded not guilty to attempted murder and other charges. 42-year-old David DePape has appeared in court, while Paul Pelosi remains in hospital with a skull fracture. CNN's Josh Campbell reports.
42-year-old David DePape making an appearance in a San Francisco court Tuesday with his arm in a sling, pleading not guilty to all state charges filed in Friday's politically motivated attack on Paul Pelosi.
We're going to be doing a comprehensive investigation of what happened. We're going to be looking into Mr. DePape, his mental state.
DePape waived his right to a hearing within 10 days and is being held in a San Francisco County jail until his next court appearance on November 4th. The judge signed a protective order for no contact with the Pelosis. DePape is facing charges that could lead to 13 years to life in prison if convicted. Those charges include attempted murder, burglary, assault with a deadly weapon, false imprisonment, as well as threats to a public official and family.
Mr. DePape specifically targeted the Pelosi home to confront Speaker Pelosi.
DePape's attorney, Deputy Public Defender Adam Lipson, responding to questions Tuesday about motive.
There's also been a lot of speculation regarding Mr. DePape's vulnerability to misinformation, and that's certainly something that we're going to look into.
Authorities are still rebutting conspiracy theories that Paul Pelosi and DePape knew each other.
There is absolutely no evidence that Mr. Pelosi knew this man.
Paul Pelosi is still hospitalized after being struck on the head with a hammer, sustaining a skull fracture and other serious injuries. Parallel investigations into the attack by the FBI and San Francisco police are now underway, with new details emerging that DePape brought 2 hammers, zip ties, rope, and a roll of tape to the Pelosi home. DePape now also faces federal charges of assault and attempted kidnapping of a U.S. official stemming from the attack, caught on police body cam, which authorities said would not be released until the case goes to trial. Now, with a wave of recent threats to elected officials, the head of the Capitol Police said Tuesday his agency's mission has become increasingly urgent. Writing in a statement, "We believe today's political climate calls for more resources to provide additional layers of physical security for members of Congress." Chief Tom Manger adding, "During this time of heightened political tension, we continue to monitor thousands of cases across the country in an effort to stop potential threats before they make headlines."
To Australia now, and there was a catastrophe at Sydney's Taronga Zoo this morning. See what we did there when 5 lions turned tail and escaped. Zookeepers say the not-so-cowardly lions breached the containment fence of their enclosure, but staff didn't know how that happened. The zoo hadn't opened for the day, but several families staying overnight for the Roar and Snore event, whoa, but close for comfort, had to make a dash for safety. Taronga Zoo says it was an emergency situation and the animals were quickly returned to their pen. The ABC's Mary Lloyd has the story.
It's not every day that Sydney's Talkback Radio takes a call about African animals on the loose.
Hey, Fordo, how are you, mate?
Good. What's going on?
I've got a good scoop for you. I've got a family member who works at the zoo.
Talkback Radio was hot on the trail with Ben Fordham taking a call from someone who knew someone doing construction work at the zoo.
And he's put a message out saying there's 4 lions on the loose and they're in lockdown.
4 lions on the loose?
They're out of their enclosure and there's alarms going off and they're all locked down in a room somewhere, all the workers.
His intel was almost spot on. It was actually 5 lions, 1 adult and 4 cubs, that had found their way out of their enclosure. Simon Duffy, director of Taronga Zoo Sydney, said everyone on site was moved to safe zones.
The lions were observed in a small area adjacent to the main lion exhibit, where a 6-foot fence separated them from the rest of the zoo.
He said the zoo has strict safety protocols for this type of event and immediate action was taken.
4 of the lions calmly made their way back into their main exhibit and dens, and 1 lion cub was safely tranquilised. It was less than 10 minutes between the lions exiting their main exhibit and the full emergency response being enacted. A full review is now underway to confirm exactly how the lions were able to exit their main exhibit.
Magnus Perry and his family had signed up to Taronga's Roar and Snore overnight experience at the zoo, and he got a bit more roar and less snore than he expected.
Well, we heard them this morning actually at 4 o'clock. They were roaring, so they woke us up, the bastards.
As soon as the lions were known to be out of their enclosure, everyone sleeping in the tents overlooking the lion's den were alerted by staff.
They came running down the tent area saying, get out of your tent, leave your belongings behind, run, come with us. And they opened the door, everyone got in, they counted us and they locked the door.
Linda Stoner is the CEO of Animal Liberation New South Wales. She was distressed to see news of the escape.
Those animals have got a small, sweet taste of freedom, and then it's back behind the bars again. We're all very distressed by the plight of animals in zoos. I hasten to add that if there's nowhere else for them to be, then a free-range zoo has to be a better option than what's available at Taronga.
She says the lion's escape is perfectly understandable.
If you're stuck in a hotel room for, the remainder of your life, no matter how plush or, lovely that hotel room is, that's not where you're meant to be. This is not where wild animals are meant to be.
In her view, there's no place for zoos like Taronga anymore.
It's such a Victorian form of entertainment.
Taronga Zoo says it promotes positive welfare for animals both in its care and in the wild.
Time for some of your reckons now on the Kane controversy. Williamson, that is. You know the catch, no catch. This person says Kane Williamson above any reproach, the penultimate Boy Scout. And Gordon says, leave the Black Caps alone. Last week they were heroes. Make us slip and we jump on them like a ton of bricks. Someone else says Kane did not try to cover it up. It was replayed over and over. Genuine mistake. He knows he could not hide a deliberate cover-up. Seen in real time, it looked like a great catch. Except it wasn't, was it? Anyway, do keep your feedback coming. 2101 on text.
RNZ News at 6 o'clock. Ngā mihi o te pō. Good evening. I'm Evie Ashton. An economist says the latest jobs numbers almost certainly cements the likelihood of a jumbo-sized interest rate rise by the Reserve Bank at the end of the month. Unemployment has held close to a record low of 3.3%, with more people working longer hours or joining the workforce. Wages have also risen at record rates, with some measures showing they've been outpacing inflation. Kiwibank's chief economist, Jared Kerr, says the RBNZ will have to respond.
I think the central bank will look at this and realise that the fight against inflation is still ongoing, and they'll lift the cash rate, I think 75 basis points in a few weeks' time to 4.25%, and then push it to 5% early next year.
Jared Kerr told Checkpoint about 2% of property owners are currently in negative equity, and that might rise. A financial mentor who helps people budget says new regulations will help prevent people getting into debt spirals with buy now, pay later lenders. The government is planning to regulate buy now, pay later schemes, and affordability checks will be required for loans over a certain threshold. North Harbour budgeting volunteer David Very says the changes will help to protect people who use buy now, pay later schemes in desperation.
It's just the fact that people can't actually afford these things. And I use an example of sometimes people will use buy now, pay later when basically their budgets are already in deficit.
David Very says he regularly helps people in debt, including those who owe money to buy now, pay later schemes. Labour's newly announced Hamilton West by-election candidate says she didn't ambush her party's own health minister. Andrew Little was in Hamilton today to make a student mental health announcement at the University of Waikato. But Stuff reports he was met by members of the Tertiary Education Union who were protesting a 2% pay rise offer. Georgia Dancy told RNZ she was at the announcement as a representative of the TEU. But she says once it became apparent the situation had turned into an ambush, she left. Ms Dancy was selected as Labour's by-election candidate yesterday. Emergency managers believe that the next few hours are critical as heavy rain lashes the west coast of the South Island. Orange level warnings remain in place for several parts of the South Island, with rivers along the coast rising rapidly. Officials are closely monitoring the Hokitika River, with high tide due at 7 o'clock this evening. Westland District Council's Civil Defence Controller, Simon Bastian, says the next few hours are pivotal. He says motorists shouldn't be travelling, with some localised flooding being reported. Bailiffs will now wear body cameras when they serve warrants, evictions and other court documents. The Ministry of Justice says it's to keep them safe and hold them accountable. Somia Barmadipati reports.
Bailiffs will have to turn their camera on before approaching a property, let people know they're recording and stop when they leave. The person being recorded will also be able to see what's being taped through a front-facing screen. The Justice Ministry says bailiffs usually work alone, visiting unfamiliar people in places, and often in highly emotive situations. It says this poses a health and safety risk, and also makes investigating complaints difficult. The ministry says it'll keep the camera footage in its systems for 90 days, unless it's being kept for an investigation.
Police are working to identify a body found in Lake Rotorua. A member of the public notified the police this afternoon. It's not yet known if it's a man who went missing while kayaking over a week ago. Israel's former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has told supporters in Jerusalem he's on the brink of a big victory after exit polls put his right-wing bloc narrowly ahead in Tuesday's general election. Mr Netanyahu's coalition combines his party Likud, an extreme right-wing nationalist party, and two ultra-Orthodox groups. The BBC's Tom Bateman reports from Jerusalem.
Mr Netanyahu's supporters celebrated as the exit polls projected a majority for his right-wing religious bloc, 61 or 62 of the 120 seats in Parliament. The vote count itself is now underway and the final numbers can still change. But if the exit polls are right, Mr Netanyahu will return to power after more than a year in opposition and will do so due to the support of a far-right ultra-nationalist party, which is on course to win up to 15 seats, becoming the third biggest party in Israeli politics.
People are being warned to be cautious if they receive an email claiming to be from the police. Police are investigating after receiving reports of scam emails claiming to be from them or other justice organisations. The emails claim to have found illegal, explicit material on the recipient's computer and say an arrest warrant will be issued if they don't reply. Police say the emails are a scam and anyone who receives one shouldn't reply under any circumstances. They say they and other government agencies will never contact people out of the blue and ask for passwords, credit card or bank details. And Peruvian police have dressed up as superheroes to carry out a drugs bust in the capital, Lima. Officers dressed as Captain America, Thor, Spider-Man and Catwoman approached a building during the Halloween weekend before using specialist equipment to break down a reinforced steel door. Officials say the costumes gave them the element of surprise, as the alleged drug dealers assumed it was a Halloween prank. 3 men and a woman have been arrested. That's the news.
Tomorrow after 1pm on Afternoons with Jessie Mulligan, Mary Holm looks at which KiwiSaver or investment fund is right for you and how much your age should be a factor. Plus we play Link 3, and in our series on New Zealand's sporting moments, we remember the Athens Olympics in 2004 when a young Sarah Ulmer took the track and made history by winning our first cycling gold medal. She joins me on Afternoons from 1pm tomorrow here on RNZ National.
Kei te whakarongo mai koutou ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. You're back with Lisa Owen next on Checkpoint. Right now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Thursday. From Northland to Taumārunui, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and Taupo. Mainly fine today, occasional rain tomorrow, clearing in the evening. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, mainly fine, some light rain possible tomorrow. From Taranaki to Wellington, including Taihape and Wairarapa. Cloud increasing today with patchy rain about Taranaki and Wellington. Rain spreading everywhere tomorrow morning, then becoming fine apart from a few evening showers. For Nelson and Marlborough, rain becoming widespread this evening, clearing to fine tomorrow morning. Canterbury Plains and Christchurch, mainly fine with high cloud, a few spots of rain possible. For Bulla, Westland, Fiordland, also Canterbury High Country. Rain with heavy falls, easing to showers tomorrow and clearing from the Canterbury High Country. Northwest gales about the Canterbury High Country today. For Otago and Southland, some rain spreading south from this evening, clearing later tomorrow. And for Te Kohu, the Chatham Islands, cloudy with occasional drizzle. The time is 7 minutes past 6. I'll have news headlines for you at 6:30.
Kia ora rā e ho, no mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. A crackdown on buy now, pay later services doesn't go far enough, according to some budgeters. Under changes proposed by the government, the services will have to credit check all consumers, and if the loans are $600 or more, they will have to assess whether the person can actually afford to pay the debt back. The likes of Afterpay, Lay-By and Zip Pay allow people to get the goods with one upfront payment and then they pay the rest off in a series of instalments. They can be charged late fees if they default, but unlike credit cards, there's no interest. But there's no requirement for credit or affordability checks, and people can take on multiple loans from different buy now, pay later providers. Senior financial mentor at Pakuranga and Howick Budgeting Services, Fiona Govinda, joins us now. Kia ora, Fiona.
Kia ora, it's Fiona here.
Does this go far enough, do you think?
Oh, definitely not. Most of the people that I'm seeing that are struggling, their credit limits are around $600, but they have a multiple of different ones from different providers, and they have no disposable income after they pay their rent and their basic bills, so the paying back part is a problem. $600 is a lot of money if you don't have it.
So do you think that check to see if they can afford to pay it back should be set at a much lower rate?
Definitely should be, because there's not even a check to see whether people have, even a question to say, do you have any other credit facilities with other buy now, pay later providers? There's no questioning of that. And if you sit down in one afternoon and roll for 5 different ones, you can easily have, 5 lots of $600.
I know you've put this to the test yourself, Fiona. You've signed up, haven't you? Tell us how easy it was and what kind of checks they did on you.
Yeah, I signed up to 3 different schemes just to see how it worked, because I was seeing increasing numbers of people with more than 20 different purchases, and their net income was so low I couldn't believe that they had thousands of dollars of available credit. It took 10 minutes. I had about $2,500 of available credit in 3 different providers. It was really easy. All I needed was a driver's licence, address and phone number and email.
And Fiona, did any of those individual providers ask if you had an account or a loan with any of the other providers?
No, they didn't. I believe that they did do a credit check in terms of seeing my credit report of what other debts I may have, but that doesn't say how many children I may have or what my rent might be or whether I even have a job.
Some of the other issues people have raised are pressure to purchase more things using this form of credit, right? Push notifications. What do you know about that?
You definitely get a lot of marketing. So what I have noticed is on my phone I get these, now that I'm not even using them, but I'll still get marketing things saying, you could win a chance to pay your power bill off if you go shopping using buy now, pay later. Things like that. So you get a lot of prompts encouraging you to purchase things that you may have looked at online. It's very clever targeted marketing, and if you're a very vulnerable consumer, it would be really, really difficult to resist.
The other issue that's been raised is unsolicited lifting of your loan value, right? So giving you access to more money even if you haven't asked for it. Should there be some restrictions on that?
Yeah, there definitely should be, but I'm more seeing people with multiple that have no spare money to pay them in the first place, so there was no checks as to whether they could afford to purchase the items, and they've purchased a lot.
So do you think the introduction of a credit check, making it compulsory, and then an affordability check at over $600 will solve those problems that you are seeing? People having multiple accounts?
Definitely not, no, because a credit report won't be updated. If you signed up to one buy now, pay later, and then you signed up to another one a day or two later or the same day, it wouldn't show on a credit report that quickly.
So what is the answer?
I think affordability assessments at a lower amount, because $600 is a lot of money for people if their rent covers, their rent and their basic living expenses are already gone when their money comes in. It's a lot of money to try and come up with.
It's not clear at the moment, Fiona, whether that's an accumulative $600 if you've got it spread across a number of services, or it's a single loan extension from one particular company.
I would say you'd be able to sign up to multiple without it being a problem, unless you were having lengthy delays between your applications.
Is there a place for these services? Because I suppose the thing is, some would argue they're better than a credit card, right? Which is stinging you with really high interest rates. Not so with these services.
I see people with late payments on multiple, 20 different payments. So there definitely is a cost component to people that are not able to afford them in the first place. Definitely seeing lots of them go into debt collection, causing people to have a default on their credit rating for 5 years. So there can be a big cost to them that way as well. But yes, there is an interest. And there could be a place. It really, I think you've got to look at what are people using them for.
And in your experience, Fiona, what kind of purchases are you seeing?
I'm seeing a lot of things that are consumed, like food, meat, things that chemist purchases, everyday living costs that are going to be needed to purchase again next week and the week after. And if you've already eaten next week's food budget, it's a real problem.
Do you see people using their credit cards to make the instalment payments?
Yes.
And what do you think of that, whether that should be possible?
I'm seeing people that are getting buy now, pay laters when they've exhausted every other available credit option. So they're using it just to try and meet the cost of living increases.
So what would your message be to the Consumer Affairs Minister as he looks at what he should do about this? What's your message to him?
I think it's a great start, but I think they're imagining people are taking on one or two purchases that maybe are substantial, but there's definitely lots of people that are using it for everyday living costs because that's the only way that they can manage at the moment, and it's something that doesn't work. And it causes a lot of harm.
Good to talk to you, Fiona. Thank you for your time. That's Fiona Govinda, who is a senior financial mentor at Pakuranga and Howick Budgeting Service. Brazil's ousted president, Jair Bolsonaro, has broken his silence, refusing to concede defeat, but he's promised to respect the constitution. His rival, Luiz Inácio da Silva, beat him by 2 million votes. There have been fears the country could descend into the same sort of violence that followed the end of Donald Trump's presidency. The ABC's Angus Randall reports.
In the Brazilian city of Sao Paulo, hundreds of protesting truck drivers bring traffic to a standstill. Some are just expressing their anger at the election loss of Jair Bolsonaro. Others are more menacing.
After 72 hours of demonstration, we will be in front of the army barracks, and the army will be in favour of us because we have the power and we don't accept what's happening.
There were fears the outgoing president would refuse to concede and inflame supporters into violence with talk of a stolen election. In his first public appearance since the loss, Jair Bolsonaro says he's been unfairly labelled anti-democratic.
As President of the Republic and a citizen, I will continue to fulfil all the commandments of our Constitution. It is an honour to be the leader of millions of Brazilians who, like me, defend economic freedom, religious freedom, freedom of opinion, honesty, and the green and yellow colours of our flag.
His chief of staff says the administration has begun the transition process to install President-elect Luiz Inácio da Silva, known as Lula. However, Mr Bolsonaro has continued to hint at unfounded issues with the country's voting system.
Os atuais movimentos populares são fruto de indignação.
The current popular actions taking place are the result of indignation and feelings of injustice at how the electoral process has unfolded.
There were concerns that in the wake of the election loss, Brazil could see its own version of America's deadly January 6th insurrection that saw Donald Trump's supporters invade the capital. Dr. Deborah Barros-Leal Farias is from the University of New South Wales.
I think it would be quite surprising, in fact, if he had gone and fully done a democratic, expectation of someone who will concede and say, I want to congratulate, now incoming President Lula. He did not do that. But I think as a silver lining, it was, put it like this, less bad, if I may, than it could have been.
So what's next for Jair Bolsonaro?
Well, I think that's the golden question that everybody has right now, because he had never lost an election. He had always been, prior to being the president, he had almost 30 years of being a state representative. There's a question of whether he would run again for president or whether he would just go back to being, let's say, try to run for a legislative position, whether as a senator or a federal state representative.
Now that the outgoing president has come as close to conceding as might be expected, focus can now shift to his successor. While Lula won the support of 60 million voters at the Sunday runoff election, Bolsonaro still attracted 58 million. Dr. Farias says Lula's first big task is to heal a nation almost split down the middle.
Lula has a challenge of, let's say, gaining the confidence of. Obviously, he's not going to get the confidence of everybody who voted for Bolsonaro, but he wants to get, as many people on the non-radical side to come along and say, look, we're starting a new chapter.
The president-elect will take office on January 1st.
Meanwhile, in Israel, in a remarkable political comeback, former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu could be returning to power. After Israel's fourth election in 5 years, exit polls give Mr Netanyahu's right-wing bloc a very slim majority. The BBC's Middle East correspondent Yolande Nell reports.
After a high turnout, exit polls suggest Israel's former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in position to take the reins of power again. But no matter what happens, his allies on the far right are jumping for joy. They're now the third largest party.
Not long ago, the leaders of religious Zionism, known as racists and extremists, were out on the fringes of Israeli politics. But this election has seen them transformed into key players.
With his eyes on a cabinet post, Itamar Ben-Gvir now tries to look like a conventional candidate. But this was him last month, inflaming tensions at a flashpoint in East Jerusalem by pointing a gun at Palestinians during clashes. Veteran campaigner Mr Netanyahu started election day waking up a startled voter and telling him to cast his ballot. Yet it's his strategic deal with the ultra-nationalists that could lead to his comeback. Current PM Yair Lapid made his pitch on the job, signing a maritime deal with Lebanon, an enemy state. His parties urged caution until all the votes are counted. But there's no caution here.
Biden, don't worry. Itamar is a very good guy.
What do you like about him?
He's a man. He's a man like American. In America, the terrorists, if some terrorists he do something not good, so in America, you're going to kill him. Only the terrorists. The Arab, it's okay.
Weeks of coalition wrangling could now follow, and there's always the chance that celebrations will be short-lived.
It's 6:20 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Things are heating up in the US where the midterm elections are just a week away. It'll be seen as a verdict on President Joe Biden's performance, and all eyes are on key states like Arizona. The BBC's John Sudworth is there.
Arizona's rugged landscapes speak to its place on America's old Wild West frontier. Today, though, it's the politics that's wild.
Some of the most corrupt elections we've ever seen.
With the state at the vanguard of the Republican Party's stolen election claim.
You're across the pond and you think you know about our election.
Well, I'm only saying the audit here. The audit showed Biden won.
Let me just say one thing. If you think you're going to come over here and tell us how things are operating, you got another thing coming.
Candidates who deny the legitimacy of the last election are now running for the job of administering the next one, with the power potentially to decide which votes count. You are still convinced that the result of the 2020 election was not sound?
Wholly convinced.
Had you held this position in 2020 and had the result of that election been on your desk here in Arizona, what would you have done?
Well, first of all, make sure that there were not votes that were outside of the law counted.
So this is the tabulation room where every single early ballot will be tabulated.
It's a system under siege, with election workers facing death threats and deluged by allegations without evidence.
It's one of the most preposterous allegations that you would think, nobody would give any credence to, but that built up a significant following and still has people that believe in it, is that we took ballots from the 2020 election, we fed them to chickens, and then we incinerated the chickens to cover the tracks.
Given all of that, how worried are you about the future health of this democracy?
I'm deeply worried.
Not everyone's glued to the politics, but it's never far away. Arizona was once a solidly Republican state, but like elsewhere in America, traditional conservatism is now grappling with rapid social change.
The myth of this stolen election is all about division, and it suggests something fundamental is being lost here. A readiness to accept that people with values that you oppose could ever legitimately win a majority.
Anybody think we're not in a war? In a war? That this civil war hasn't already begun?
But while far-right groups make inflammatory claims of war,
into economic collapse.
This meeting is sparsely attended, and a local Democrat candidate has even accepted an invitation to speak.
Okay. All right, it's fine.
The democratic process somehow struggles on for now. In this state, though, it's clear how this country's political fault lines are deepening. And in an election in which democracy itself is on the ballot, the polls are close.
Russian soldiers taken prisoner in Ukraine have given their first frank accounts of their experience of the war. Some say they were duped about training and where they would be sent to fight. The ABC's Greg Jennett went inside Ukraine's central POW camp.
Winning wars nearly always results in the killing or capture of enemy fighters. Casualty counts measure the former, but the captives are seldom seen or heard. Now, we've been given access inside this Ukrainian prison camp at a location we can't reveal. To try to correct that, we'll attempt to show the plight of the enemy held within.
Cut off from Mother Russia, the price of entry was surrender, yet glum faces suggest it felt like abject defeat. TV tells a little of the old world through the enemy's lens, otherwise it's silence. Tedium and melancholy are punctuated by just a few moments in the daily regime. Exercise is one. Calls home are allowed for up to 15 minutes. We love you very much. We're really worried about you, Jurov's mother tells him from Luhansk. Russians told the coal mining reservist he'd probably dig trenches just back from the front line. Instead, Jurov's unit was scattered on the battlefield. He wandered the forest for 6 days before capture.
I have seen a lot, but my nerves are made of steel, like people in Luhansk and Donbass say about miners. So I will be strong. I will get over it.
Strength of mind remains a work in progress. 21-year-old Siberian Nikita's battled broken bodies beyond repair. He jumped on a mine laid by his own in a trench and hopes for prosthetics to walk when he gets home. As for his roommate Vitaly, whose leg was shattered by a grenade, as a student, he tells us, he was duped into thinking he was off for training. Instead, he was plunged into battle with none. 3 days later in Kharkiv.
All mobilised troops have the same story. We weren't trained, just sent. Nobody was trained. Sent like the idiots to slaughter.
Ukrainian prison authorities who supervised this visit say they did it for transparency, to demonstrate their care of Russian POWs not only complies with Geneva Convention standards, it far exceeds the way Ukrainian forces are treated in their enemy captivity. Certainly no Russians we spoke to here complain to us of food, discipline or treatment in general, even if they don't care for their pitiful existence in incarceration. Aside from prisoner swaps, though, the best hope for any of them is release at war's end, whenever that might be.
You may not have heard of Joseph Bologne, but in his time he was said to be as famous as Mozart. The first classical composer of African ancestry was effectively erased from history by Napoleon during the French Revolution. Now his comic opera, The Anonymous Lover, is being revived. The BBC's Richard Hamilton reports.
Joseph Bologne, Chevalier de Saint-Georges, was the illegitimate son of a French aristocrat and a slave girl from his plantation on the Caribbean colony of Guadeloupe. At the age of 7, Joseph travelled to France, where he enjoyed a privileged education. He grew up in an era when racism was still enshrined in law, but became an exceptional horseman, fencer, violinist, conductor and composer. He also led France's first all-black regiment in the French Revolution and was a prized guest in the salons of Paris. But the director of the concert, which includes his work, Simone Ibbett-Brown, says it was his stance against the slave trade that provoked Napoleon Bonaparte to suppress his legacy.
Napoleon, who was a great was supported a lot by many slave traders. It wasn't a very good look for him to have such a prominent and important member of the French Revolution as a black man in that time. So much of his work was lost to us, was destroyed from history, was banned at the beginning of the 19th century.
Joseph died in Paris in 1799 in relative obscurity, as eventually did his music. 3 years after his death, Napoleon reintroduced slavery in its Caribbean colonies. In his lifetime, Joseph Bologne composed numerous operas, symphonies, string quartets and violin concertos. But The Anonymous Lover is his only complete surviving opera. Interest in his work was only recently revived, and The Anonymous Lover was streamed to an audience in Los Angeles during the COVID pandemic. This concert will be held at several venues across England this month, before finishing at Glyndebourne in Sussex in December.
And that is about all we have time for. Ko te kaupapa tuatahi a pōpō. Tomorrow from 5 a.m. on First Up, they ask a leading ESR scientist about the so-called variant soup. That doesn't sound tasty. That's leading to rising COVID numbers as we head into the summer. Do tune in. Kaua e wareware te atatero e a mātou kōrero. Check out our videos and stories online. Catch you tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Kia ora tātou, ko Evie Ashton tēnei. A financial mentor who helps people budget says new regulations will help prevent people getting into debt spirals with buy now, pay later lenders. Orange level warnings are in place for several parts of the South Island, with rivers along the coast rising rapidly. Emergency managers say the next few hours are critical as heavy rain lashes the west coast. And the police say they don't have plans to follow the Ministry of Justice by introducing body-worn cameras. Bailiffs are being equipped with body cameras from this week. Those are the headlines. Our next news and weather is at 7.
Tonight on RNZ National, they've come to epitomise the quintessential Kiwi holiday and, for some, a viable and cost-effective place to live. We go big on caravans, old and new. Then it's into nature to soothe our nervous systems with cool, calming forest bathing. Get your popcorn ready because we're off to the movies with Simon Morris, and Hayden Donnell is in with us for Midweek Media Watch. Catch you after 7 for Nights with me, Charlotte Ryan, and for Karen Hay on RNZ National.
It's time for Trending Now. Tonight, why isn't Auckland's new mayor Wayne Brown saying yes to more media interviews?
How would you rate your first 3 weeks in office?
Interesting. Is that all right?
Any more words than just the one?
Oh, very interesting.
Kia ora, I'm Sharon Brett Kelly, and it's been very interesting for us as well. It's nearly 4 weeks since Wayne Brown was elected Mayor of Auckland, and he's done just a handful of interviews and press conferences. That's less than other mayors do in one day, much less. Day after day, journalists